You know, there are some nights that never quite leave you. They settle into your bones like the chill of an October wind, and no matter how many summers pass, you can still feel them if you sit still long enough. For me, one of those nights began in the summer of 1958, in a town so small that if you blinked while driving through, you'd swear it never existed. I was 18 that July. Thought I knew everything. Thought the world was just waiting for me to rev the engine and take off. My pride and joy was a cherry red '49 Ford I'd bought with 2 years of grocery store paychecks and a little help from my father, who pretended he wasn't proud when I drove it home but stood at the window watching me polish it every evening. That summer smelled like cut grass and gasoline. The town pool echoed with cannonballs and transistor radios. And every Friday night, the neon sign at Miller's Diner buzzed like it had something important to say. That's where I first noticed her. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She walked into Miller's with a pale yellow dress that caught the light like sunlight through curtains. I'd seen her before at church, sitting 3 pews ahead, but that night she wasn't somebody's daughter or somebody's sister. She was just Clara. Laughing at something her friend whispered, brushing a strand of brown hair behind her ear. Now, I'd talked to girls before. Fumbled my way through awkward sentences and sweaty palms. But something about her made my throat tighten. I remember thinking, if I don't say something now, I'll regret it the rest of my life. So I did what any terrified 18-year-old would do. I marched up to the jukebox, dropped in a nickel, and selected All I Have to Do Is Dream. I didn't have the courage to speak yet, but I figured maybe music could go where my words couldn't. And here's the funny part, she looked up. Right at me. I thought my heart might punch through my shirt. She smiled, just a little, like she knew exactly what I was trying to say without saying it. That was the first turn in my life I didn't see coming. We started slow. Milkshakes shared with 2 straws. Walks past the hardware store after it closed. She told me she wanted to be a teacher someday. Said she wanted to show children the world was bigger than our little town. I told her I planned to work at the Ford plant 2 counties over. Good pay, steady work. She nodded like she believed in me more than I believed in myself. One evening, sitting on the hood of my car overlooking Miller's Pond, she asked me a question I wasn't ready for. "Do you ever want to leave?" she said. I laughed it off at first. Said, "Leave what? We've got everything right here." But she didn't smile. "I don't mean for a vacation," she said softly. "I mean really leave." I didn't have an answer. That was the first time I realized her dreams stretched farther than mine. It unsettled me. Made me wonder if loving someone meant keeping up with them or holding them back. By August, we were inseparable. People in town started calling us Clara and Jim like it was one word. I'd never felt so certain about anything. I told my mother I was going to marry that girl someday. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You better make sure you deserve her first." Then September came with a thin envelope from the government. I can still see it in my father's hands. He didn't say much. Just handed it to me across the kitchen table. The draft notice felt heavier than paper should feel. The room went quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Clara was the first person I told. We sat on the old swing set behind her house. The chains creaked as we swayed, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have words ready. "How long?" she asked. 2 years, I said, though it felt like a lifetime. She stared at the ground. "You'll come back," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. I promised her I would. Promises are easy when you're young. You don't yet know how fragile they can be. Basic training hardened me in ways I hadn't expected. The world got louder, sharper. Letters from Clara became my anchor. She wrote about the town, about Mrs. Donnelly's new curtains, about Miller's diner getting a fresh coat of paint. She tucked pressed flowers into her envelopes. I kept them in my locker like treasure. Then one letter arrived that felt different. The handwriting wavered. She'd been accepted into a teaching program in Chicago. I read that sentence 3 times before it made sense. Chicago. 200 miles away. A city neither of us had ever seen. She wrote that she almost didn't apply. Said she didn't want to complicate things. But she also wrote, "If I don't try, I'll always wonder who I might have been." I folded that letter and sat on my bunk long after lights out. I wanted to be proud. I truly did. But a small, selfish part of me felt abandoned. I'd pictured coming home, slipping back into the rhythm of our town, picking up where we left off. Suddenly, the future didn't look the way I'd drawn it in my mind. When I finally wrote back, I told her I was proud. Told her she'd make the finest teacher that city ever saw. And I meant it. But I also asked, carefully, where does that leave us? Her reply took longer than usual. Each day without it felt like a tightening string around my chest. When it came, her honesty cut deeper than any insult could have. She said she loved me. But she didn't know if love alone could bridge the distance between who we were becoming. For the first time, I wondered if loving someone sometimes meant letting them grow beyond you. The next year passed in a blur of drills and doubt. We kept writing, but the letters grew shorter. Less frequent. I heard about her first classroom assignment. About the noise of the trains outside her apartment. About how big the lake looked compared to Miller's Pond. And then, one cold February afternoon, a letter didn't come at all. Instead, I got a small box. Inside it was the pressed flower I'd once sent her, returned carefully between 2 sheets of paper. And a note. She had met someone. A fellow teacher. Kind, ambitious. She wrote that it hadn't been planned. That life simply moved forward when she did. I won't lie to you, I walked behind the barracks that night and cried where no one could see. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even betrayal. It was the quiet understanding that the life I'd imagined had slipped through my fingers. When I came home in 1961, the town looked smaller. Miller's diner's neon still buzzed, but it didn't feel the same. I parked by the pond and sat on the hood of my Ford, now a little rusted around the edges. I half expected her to walk up in that yellow dress. But she didn't. I heard she'd married that teacher. Settled in Chicago. Started a family. For a long time, I avoided thinking about her. Threw myself into factory work. Married your grandmother 3 years later, and now, let me tell you something important. Loving your grandmother was not a consolation prize. She was steady and warm and laughed with her whole body. She grounded me in ways Clara never could have. But there are chapters in your life that shape you, even if they don't last. In 1974, I went to Chicago on a work trip. First time I'd ever set foot in that city. The buildings rose like mountains. The lake stretched endless and gray. And wouldn't you know it, I saw her. It happened in the most ordinary way. I was standing in line at a coffee shop, fumbling for change, when I heard my name spoken in a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. I turned around slowly, like I was afraid the past might disappear if I moved too fast. There she was. Older, of course. Lines at the corners of her eyes. But the same steady gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. We sat at a small table by the window. She told me about her students. About her 2 boys. About her husband, who'd passed away the year before from a heart condition. That caught me off guard. The world had dealt her its own share of sorrow. She asked about my life. I told her about the factory, about your grandmother, about our little house with the peeling white paint. I spoke with pride. And then she reached across the table and said something I've carried with me ever since. "Jim," she said, "loving you taught me how to be brave." I didn't know what to say to that. She explained that leaving town had terrified her. That our love had given her the confidence to step into a bigger world. "You believed in me," she said. "Even when it hurt." I realized then that our story hadn't ended in loss. It had simply transformed into something quieter. Something foundational. We walked along the lake before parting ways. No dramatic promises. No lingering glances. Just gratitude. When I got back home, I told your grandmother about seeing Clara. Every detail. Your grandmother listened, then squeezed my hand and said, "Sounds like you both became who you were meant to be." She wasn't jealous. She understood something I was only beginning to grasp, that the heart is big enough to hold gratitude for what was and devotion to what is. Now, all these years later, when I sit at this kitchen table and the house is quiet, I sometimes think about that young boy with the red Ford and trembling hands at the jukebox. If he'd been too afraid to drop that nickel, his life might have unfolded differently. Not necessarily better or worse. Just different. Clara taught me that love isn't always about possession. Sometimes it's about release. Sometimes it's about cheering someone on even when their path doesn't circle back to yours. And here's the part that still brings a gentle ache to my chest: if I hadn't loved her, I might not have known how to love your grandmother as fully as I did. Loss carved space in me. Space that later filled with steadier joy. I don't regret that summer of 1958. I don't regret the letters, or even the heartbreak. Because every step, every unexpected turn, led me here. To this table. To this life. And every now and then, when an old song drifts through the radio, I can still see a girl in a yellow dress glancing up from across a diner, smiling like she already knew how the story would unfold. It wasn't the ending I once imagined. But it was exactly the one I needed.